Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come here. It's a great honor. I know that I'm addressing many people in the audience who have been previously members of the London School of Economics and Political Science. There is a distinction between, as I'm sure many of you in the audience know, between economists and political scientists. I'm a political scientist, not an economist. One of our great political philosophers, Michael Oakeshott, in the 1950s, found himself in a magistrate's court for a minor sexual misdemeanor. It was actually skinny dipping. I don't know whether you know what skinny dipping is. That's going naked swimming with a former student. Today that's an extracurricular activity, but in those days it was an offence. And he found himself in a magistrate's court, and he was fined £200, which was a lot of money in those days. And the magistrate said to him, "Mr. Oakeshott, do you have anything to say in mitigation of your offence?" And he said, "Nothing at all, sir, but I would like to point out, on my salary at the London School of Economics, I cannot afford a fine of £200. And the magistrate said, "It's precisely because, Mr. Oakeshott, you are a professor of moral philosophy, that I am fining you £200. You really should have known better." And he said, "If I may correct you, sir, I'm not a professor of moral philosophy. I am merely a professor of political science." At which point the magistrate agreed to reduce the fine by £100 on the grounds that he clearly didn't know any better. Now, I'm here as a political scientist to talk about Thucydides. I had originally intended to deliver a lecture on Churchill and Thucydides. T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, wrote of Churchill's 4-volume history of the First World War, which is called The World Crisis, which is as much about Churchill's role in the First World War as it was about the First World War. I suppose he's the only person since Thucydides to put his generation in his debt. In other words, he was comparing The World Crisis, the book, with a book that had been written over 2,000 years earlier, Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. Lawrence had Greek. He was able to read Attic Greek. Churchill didn't have Greek. Lawrence actually said that his main reason why he should be a translator of Homer's Iliad was that, unlike all other translators of Homer's Iliad, he'd actually killed lots of people, and therefore he knew what he was talking about. And I think we can say Lawrence actually killed more than the 64 people that Homer actually mentions by name in the 24 books of the Iliad. Churchill didn't have Greek, which is why he didn't go to university. When he came back from South Africa, having been both a soldier and a prisoner of war, he thought of going up to Oxford. He was told that if he wanted to go to Oxford, he would have to know some ancient Greek. And his response was very Churchillian. He said, "I'm afraid that having come back from South Africa, where I had the honor of commanding British regular troops in the field, you cannot expect me to master Greek irregular verbs." In the darkest day of the Second World War, when there was an attempt at a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons in 1942 against Churchill's government, his friend and confidant, Max Beaverbrook, sent him a quotation from Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. "Show that you are not crushed by your afflictions." He wasn't. He won the vote by 464 votes to 1. But that's not the lecture that I'm going to deliver today. That's the lecture I would have delivered. But here is the lecture I am going to deliver. And I want to focus not on the past, I want to focus on the present, because that's what I write about and that's what I lecture about. I write about conflicts today rather than conflicts yesterday. And I want to claim that Thucydides is our contemporary, even more perhaps than he was Churchill's contemporary. Churchill, who of course lived in an era of great power conflict, of total war, or the mobilization of societies against each other. Today, we do not live in such an era. We fight wars against non-state actors for the most part. I think Thucydides has a lot to tell us about what we're dealing with today, as much as Churchill believed he had to tell him about the 1940s. Now, where is Thucydides, you might ask? And it's a pretty good question. I mean, he's not on the lips of Donald Trump. He's not on the lips of Hillary Clinton. George Herbert Bush, the one we like, banned any mention of Thucydides from his speeches because he had difficulty pronouncing his name. His son, George W. Bush, had never heard of him, which is what comes when you take too much dope at Yale. I was banned from the German Marshall Center for making that joke, and I'm still banned as a result. Where is he in the airport bookshops? Oh, there are plenty of books on Sun Tzu's Art of War. As you know, any of you have gone into an airport bookshop. I saw a book on Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu was almost a near contemporary of Thucydides, probably, as we think. I saw a book the other day in a bookshop in an airport, Master Sun Tzu's 12 Tactics for Dating Women. Well, you're not going to find Thucydides is any help whatsoever in that respect. I saw a photograph of Paris Hilton last year holding up a copy of Sun Tzu's Art of War. I don't think she's likely to be found holding up a copy of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. She too, like George W. Bush, has probably not heard of Thucydides. But he's there. He's lurking in the shadows. He's in our unspoken thoughts. He's in our half-remembered passages that some of us, like myself, who read him, even in the original Greek, long time ago at school, can't do that now. He's there in our imagination. And he tends to surface whenever we find ourselves in difficulty, whenever we find that we have done things we shouldn't have done. And that's the Thucydides I want to talk about this evening. And I was told to prepare a PowerPoint presentation, but I haven't done so. I did, actually, but it only had 3 slides. There's no point. As an early British historian, Lord Acton might have said, were he alive today, power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. All sorts, anyway, of quotations, since I've misquoted Lord Acton, are attributed to Thucydides. Here's one. A country that doesn't have soldier scholars will have its fighting done by idiots and its thinking done by fools. He never actually said that. The person who probably said that was the philosopher who taught Thucydides, Anaxarchus. But he might have said it because it's a sentiment he would have shared. And here's another quotation that you will not find in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. When Colin Powell was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the 1990s, he used to display on the desk in his office a quotation of Thucydides: of all exercises of power, restraint is the most important. And again, that quotation is not to be found in Thucydides' History, but it's certainly something that Thucydides believed in. Which brings me to my subject this evening, the ongoing and the never-ending war on terror that we have been involved in since 9/11. And I want to discuss 2 things. First of all, how history might have been very different if the Bush administration had actually read Thucydides. It certainly probably wouldn't have invaded Iraq, which David Kilcullen, who was a special advisor to General Petraeus, who was in Iraq in 2007, has said in his most recent book, reviewed in the Financial Times last week, was the greatest strategic disaster in modern history since Hitler's invasion of Russia in 1941. Disaster because we're living with its consequences today. Restraint is the best exercise of power. What did Thucydides mean by that? The answer is to be found, I think, in a passage which I'm now going to quote, which is actually in his history. And it's about the greatest strategic disaster that Athens engaged in during its 30-year war with Sparta, which was the invasion of Sicily in 415 BC, the attack on a Greek city-state called Syracuse, which was, by the way, a democracy, like Athens. So don't let them tell you that democracies don't go to war against each other, because it's an excellent example of two democracies that were at war with each other. And this is the passage in Thucydides' history. And now I regret that I didn't put it up on the screen, but here it is. The best way, he writes, and this is a speech by one of the principal Athenian politicians in the popular assembly, arguing against the invasion of Sicily. The best way for us to make ourselves feared by the Greeks in Sicily is not to go there at all. And the next best thing is to make a demonstration of our power and then immediately go away. Because we all know that what is most admired is what furthest off and least liable to have its reputation put to the test. So what Thucydides is saying here is power is unmeasurable, it's formidable in the eyes of the beholder, but once it's used, once you translate power into force, one currency into another currency, it dissipates very quickly. And of course, this is precisely what happened with the Americans in Iraq. Now, the Americans knew about Thucydides in the run-up to the invasion in 2003. He's actually been on the syllabus of the US Marine Corps since 1972. One of his greatest champions was the classical historian Victor Davis Hanson, who wrote in an article in the New York Times shortly after the invasion of Iraq, "We are more likely to believe what a dead white European male, brackets Thucydides, has to say to us about war than today's finest social scientists." A dead white European male. Well, there's another acronym we now use, by the way. We don't talk about dead white European males any longer. We talk about weird people. W-E-I-R-D. Western, educated, industrialized, and rich. Well, I can tell you Thucydides was none of those things. He wasn't Western, he was educated, he wasn't industrialized, and he wasn't rich. But there we are. That's what we're stuck with. The point is, as one classical scholar, David Mendelsohn, later complained, those who pushed for the invasion of Iraq did indeed mention Thucydides all the time, but they misquoted him, or they quoted him out of context. They never came to terms with the ambiguity, the subtlety of his thought. Now, the speech that I've just cited, was that a speech that Thucydides heard? We don't know. Was it a speech that he paraphrased? We don't know. Did he make it up? We don't know. Was it a speech that he thought the character who made it should have said or would have said? We don't know. This is the problem with Thucydides. We don't know about his speeches. But I think we do know one thing. It's a speech that Thucydides thought was correct. In other words, the fellow who was arguing against the expedition to Sicily was essentially saying, don't go because you know so little about the situation. This is the first time in history that any political unit had sent an expedition by sea so far. The Athenians certainly didn't know how big Sicily was. It took 8 days for their triremes to actually row around the island. They didn't know that at the time. What they did know was that their great leader Pericles had warned them that the Spartans weren't terribly clever, and that they probably would win, but the greatest problem they faced was themselves, because they were too clever. That they would be responsible for their own defeat if it happened, because they overreached themselves. And Pericles, I think, posthumously, because he was dead by that time, was proved right. In other words, success breeds hubris, and hubris leads to nemesis. And significantly, the debate in the Athenian assembly about whether to send the expedition to Sicily or not was a debate between the old and the young. It was the debate between the old guys who said, I think we shouldn't really risk too much, and the young guys led by their spokesman, Alcibiades, who said, look, let's go for it. It was an intergenerational conflict between the old and the young. It rather reminds me of the debate in 2002 in the run-up to the war in Iraq between the United States that could do anything and Europe, particularly old Europe, as Donald Rumsfeld called it, as opposed to new Europe, the Europeans who didn't have self-belief and the courage of their convictions. So what Thucydides tells us, essentially, and this is the point that I want to get across this evening, is that strategy is deeply paradoxical. Thucydidean scholars talk about Thucydidean irony, and I want to talk about three paradoxes that bring this into perspective. The first is the first paradox. Athens should have won the war, of course, because in every respect it was superior to Sparta, in terms of its ingenuity, its innovativeness. Sorry, I have difficulty in the English language. I'm glad that's not in Greek. The point was that the result, Athens lost, was a surprise. And that, of course, is the essence of Greek tragedy. The Greek tragedies written by Aeschylus and Sophocles and later Euripides, that when a tragedy begins, the chief protagonist, Oedipus, for example, is a supremely intelligent person. And so the audience does not expect that at the end of the play, he is the person who is going to be expelled from the city in shame and degradation. The problem is that Oedipus is clever enough to answer the riddle of the Sphinx, but not clever enough to answer the riddle of his own life. Everyone expected in the Greek world the Athenians would win against Sparta. I think the Spartans probably expected it themselves. We don't have the sources telling us this. The trouble was that the Athenians believed their own cover story. They believed because they were so daring and so had such ingenuity, they couldn't possibly fail. In the great debate in the assembly to send the expedition to Sicily, Alcibiades keeps adding to the risks of the expedition. And the more he identifies the risks, the more the Athenian people say, let's go for it, because we can. And Thucydides paints a famous picture of the people of Athens going down to Piraeus to see the expedition going off to Sicily, torn by fear and hope. And Thucydides, level-headed as ever, reminds his audience about the cost of the expedition. Well, the parallels with the American expedition in Iraq, it seems to me, are many and rather disturbing. The opponents of the invasion, Colin Powell in particular, the Secretary of State, who was against it from day one but went along with it, famously told President Bush, if you break it, you own it. If it goes wrong, we're going to be stuck there for a very long time. The neoconservatives in the United States insisted that, like Lehman Brothers, it was too big to fail. There was no way the United States could fail. To try to bring this into perspective, I would say this is what we call a moral hazard. And the insurance industry has been dealing with moral hazards for the last 250 years. A moral hazard is what happens when you give somebody a life insurance policy and they know that their families are provided for, and they go off and do something that they really shouldn't, like bungee jumping or smoking 30 packets of cigarettes a day. Once they have insurance, they actually do things they shouldn't do. A moral hazard is a Formula One racing driver, because he's a better driver than anybody else in this audience, takes risks on the racing track that you and I would not do because he's a better driver. And that's precisely what the United States did in 2003. It invaded Iraq because it could. And it failed. Athens sent an expedition to Sicily because it could. It was the only city-state in the Greek world that could actually do something like that. And because you can do something, it's not a reason for why you should do something. The second paradox is the old tragic formula that Aristotle identifies in the Poetics. Hubris is followed by nemesis. You know, the Athenians were extremely arrogant, and that's what we like about them. There are many things we don't like about the ancient Athenians. We don't like the slavery. We don't like the misogyny. They were amongst the most misogynistic people in the ancient world. We don't like the superstition. They were incredibly superstitious. But we love their arrogance because we think that made them modern. We love the fact that they did the unexpected, that they did something like sending an expeditionary force, the first amphibious expedition in history, hundreds of miles away, to invade part of Sicily. That's what we like about them. But of course, nemesis followed. And as Aristotle says in the Poetics about tragedy, when nemesis follows, it's followed by something called anagnosis, which is a recognition, a terrible recognition that you are responsible for your own failings. And that's the picture that Thucydides shows us when the expedition to Sicily failed. It was a terrible failure. 50,000 Athenians died. The survivors were sold into slavery. They were worked to death in what was left of their lives in the mines. And as they were led to captivity, Thucydides paints a vivid portrayal of them looking back at the sea from where they'd come, back to Athens on the horizon, and realizing that the only people who were responsible for their fate was themselves. They were the architects of their own misfortune. Now, I'm not sure whether the neoconservatives in the United States recognize the extent to which they were the architects of America's misfortune, the insurgency that followed the invasion of Iraq, the near civil war in 2004, 2006, now ISIS. Kilcullen is right. ISIS is a result of the American invasion of Iraq. The slogan amongst the neoconservatives in Washington in 2003 was, after Baghdad, Beijing. Let's go for the real regime change. Let's kind of hop over Iran, which was going to be the next country. Let's try and change the regime in Beijing. Alcibiades made it perfectly plain that after Syracuse had fallen, he wanted to attack Carthage, North Africa. In other words, the Athenians were heading for a fall because they didn't know when to stop. That was the tragedy that Thucydides writes about. The third paradox is that, of course, the Athenians were trying to make themselves secure in a war, but they were over-insuring themselves. They were operating at the far end of their logistic capability. We call it, in the strategic studies community, the culminating point of operations. Like Napoleon, who managed to get to Moscow in 1812. That's as far as he could get, the culminating point of operations, and being unable to sustain himself. The fact that they could send an expeditionary force as far as Sicily was a strategic disaster in itself, because the invasion of Sicily was completely unnecessary. Alcibiades, what's the argument he comes up with in the assembly against the conservatives opposing the expedition? Comes up with 3 arguments. If we don't go to Sicily, we will not be respected by our fellow Greeks. And if we're not respected, this is number 2, by our fellow Greeks, we will not be feared by our fellow Greeks. And argument number 3, if we're not feared by our fellow Greeks, we will be attacked by our fellow Greeks. The invasion of Iraq is totally unnecessary. It was against the wrong enemy at the wrong time and in the wrong place. What Thucydides tells us, I think, is he gives us a vital insight into the irony of war, all wars. Victory is often elusive. Wars don't always produce the results you would like. But what war does is it gives us an insight into human nature. But it's not a very attractive insight into human nature. It reveals what the great French writer Alexis de Tocqueville called habits of the human heart. We have a supreme ability to live in a world of our own imagining. We have the great ability to think that we can ride the wave of history. We have a great ability to be in denial about our own limitations and our own faults. Now, there are many other reasons for reading Thucydides. He's the first military historian in the Western world. He's the first political theorist in the Western world. He's the first writer to tell us about strategy and strategic thinking, and the first writer to tell us about tactics. At the Battle of Delium, one of the only two major battles of the Peloponnesian War, land battles. All the other battles were sea battles. He tells us how the cavalry attacked a flank of the enemy. This is the first time that we know about tactics in the ancient world. By the way, the Battle of Delium was the battle where Socrates was almost killed. It was his 3rd battle. And if Socrates had died that day, I wonder what the future of Western philosophy would have been. That's an interesting thought, but it's just a footnote. Strategy, because Pericles is the very first person we know of in the ancient world, thanks to Thucydides, who asks himself a strategic question. Not, am I going to win the battle tomorrow? This was of no interest to him at all. Am I going to win the war? It's going to be a long war. It's a war between an asymmetric war between a land power, Sparta, that has no navy, and Athens, that has no army to speak of, but has a huge navy. We're a naval power, but we're not an island. It's not Britain in the 19th century or Japan in the 20th century. So how are we going to fight this war? Well, we're going to have a long war. It's going to last for many, many years. That's my strategy. We're going to bleed the Spartans dry. We're going to hemorrhage away their power. And we're going to do so because we can shelter behind our walls in the city as they burn down our farms outside, because we have a navy. And that navy will supply us with grain as far afield as the Athenian navy did, as Egypt and South Russia. And meanwhile, we'll lead these expeditionary forces, these amphibious operations around the Greek coast. And we'll keep our empire together, these 23 city-states that are part of our empire, because they pay the taxes to give us the navy. That was a wonderful strategy, very clever. So why did it fail? Nobody quite knows. Historians cannot agree. Pericles died, of course, from the plague. Was he wrong? Was it a bad strategy? Was it a strategy that his successors couldn't grasp? I don't think it was. The problem was the war lasted too long, and in the course of those 30 years, the Spartans, who couldn't think strategically at all, realized that they had to come up with a strategy. And they did. They went to Persia and said, give us money, and we can put together a fleet, and we can defeat the Athenians at sea, their own domain of war, which they did twice. Now, this is, I think, the lesson that Thucydides might have told us had he lived long enough to finish his work. But the longer a war lasts, the more the enemy will work out your strategy and will come up with a better strategy of its own. And that's probably what ISIS is doing today, compared with a rather broken-backed organization called Al-Qaeda that seems to have run out of strategic options. But its successor has a very successful strategy. And then there's something else that I'll just mention as I go in parenthesis, which is the so-called Thucydidean trap. And that's extremely important. What happens, this is the origins of the Peloponnesian War, when a status quo power and or declining power, in this case Sparta, comes across a country, in this case Athens, which is rising. It could be China that is rising, that is coming across a status quo and or declining power called the United States. At his very first press conference, General Dempsey, Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, back in 2013, told the journalists that my first priority on my watch as chairman is to make sure the United States does not fall into the Thucydidean trap. On his very first visit to the United States, Xi Jinping, the present Chinese president, said, my first priority as Chinese president is that we don't fall into the Thucydidean trap. Thucydides is read in China as well. But that's not the Thucydides I want to talk about in what remains of my talk this evening. I want to talk about Thucydides, the social psychologist. I want to talk about Thucydides and ISIS, what he would have made of this organization, which we find more dangerous than Al-Qaeda, more successful than Al-Qaeda, and much more disturbing than Al-Qaeda in terms of being able to deal with it or understand it. And this brings me to the two-word description of war that Thucydides gives in his book. What is war? He says it's to anthropon. It's the human thing. That is so important, because in the world today we are dealing with gadgets and inventions and technological quick fixes and drones and killer robots coming to a theater of war near you. We have forgotten that war is the human thing. ISIS hasn't. Now, back in 1943, the American social psychologist Abraham Maslow drew up a hierarchy of human needs. He said that there are three things that human beings need for their life. And two of those on the list, of course, you'd expect. Food, survival, so that we can live from day to day. Security, so we have safety. We find someone who's going to make us safe. And then he added a third human need to his list, which he called self-actualization. And what he meant by self-actualization, because he defined it, is meaningfulness. That we go through life thinking that our lives have meaning. What's really surprising, and what did surprise social psychologists at the time, was that he said for some people, not most people, but for some people, meaningfulness comes first. It comes before security, and it comes before food. Well, it shouldn't really have been a surprise. Take the early Christian martyrs, who died quite willingly to testify to the truth of their faith. Take the first Crusader knights, who often sold their estates so that they could actually travel to the Middle East. They needed the money to capture Jerusalem and put their families, their wives and children, in the protection of monks and monasteries. That's self-actualization. Take young jihadists today and suicide bombers, of whom there seem to be no shortage, who are putting self-actualization first. Now, why do they join up? why do young British and French and Germans and Danes join up and become jihadists? Quite frankly, we don't know. But then I could say to you, why do people become serial killers? And I mention serial killers because the FBI has a profiling unit at Quantico in Virginia so that we can identify potential serial killers. But here's the thing. Not a single serial killer who has been captured in the United States has ever been profiled before his or her capture. It's only after they've been caught that they fit the FBI profile. And the same is true of today's jihadists. They come from rich countries, they come from poor countries. They come from liberal democracies, they come from autocracies. They come from developed economies, they come from developing economies. We really don't know what motivates them. But of course, we speculate. And the speculation that I find most convincing is boredom. Boredom. And the chance to render their marginal lives meaningful at the same time. This is not only true of young Muslims who join ISIS, it's true of members of biker gangs in Denmark and evangelical churches in the United States who go off to the Middle East to fight for the Kurds. It's true, I think, of fundamentalist Christian websites in America that talk of a reverse jihad or a crusade against ISIS. Well, Thucydides has something to tell us about this. On the wall of the Imperial War Museum in London, there is a quotation from his history of the Peloponnesian War. There were great numbers of young men who had never been in a war and were consequently far from unwilling to join in this one. Many jihadists come back disillusioned by what they find. Many more find it's everything that they asked for. The first British suicide bomber for ISIS, who blew himself up in Iraq in 2009, left a note to his family which just said it was better than Call of Duty. That's a computer game to which he was addicted. Now, boredom is not what you and I may think of it. That's looking at a TV and reaching for the remote control console so that we can switch channels because we're bored by what we're watching. That's not what sociologists define as boredom. Boredom for them is a term that masks a whole constellation of independent disorders, including frustration and depression. And boredom can grow rancid very quickly and turn into a toxic mix of resentment and malice. And jihadism is what sociologists call identity fusion. It's the chance for people to join the band of brothers and to find meaning in social camaraderie. Like the 300,000 Muslims, by the way, who were recruited by the German army during the Second World War, who went off in 3 total separate divisions to fight on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. Not, I think, because they were against communism or because they believed in fascism, but because it was something that gave them meaning. Or the Norwegians or Dutch or Danish members of Waffen-SS units in the Second World War who used to strut around Europe in their Hugo Boss uniforms because it was so cool. And for young men, I think, from the slums of Paris and the sink estates of the United Kingdom, you can act in your own snuff movie, you can behead someone on TV, and it's all so ideologically permitted. Thucydides had an insight, I think, into this behavior, which few other people have had. There are a few exceptions. One was Shakespeare, but then I think nothing was beyond Shakespeare's imagination. In King Lear, a character remarks, "Humanity will prey on itself like monsters of the deep." Another was Nietzsche, who in his book, Also sprach Zarathustra, says, "How many sportive monsters are lurking at the bottom of the sea. And then if you like more popular culture, here's his Captain Barbossa from Pirates of the Caribbean. You're off the edge of the map, mate. Here there really are monsters. There are monsters out there. Thucydides understood it. This is what Thucydides said about them. It's a chilling paragraph in his history. Human nature, always ready to offend, even when law exists, showed itself proudly in its true colors, as something incapable of controlling passion, deaf to the idea of justice, and here's the killer point, the enemy of everything superior to itself. The enemy of everything superior to itself. It's a very sobering formula for those in this audience who like to think that the term humanity is not only a word that we use to describe a species that struts around the planet, but also the qualities which we think it actually embodies. Now, there was another Greek writer, the poet Pindar, who called war the thing of fear. Thucydides calls it the human thing. To call something a thing is actually to acknowledge it's so complex that you can't come up with a more precise word for it. And war is to be found in our heads, but it's also to be found in our hearts. It's to be found in our imagination, the understanding that things can be other than they are. And that's why Thucydides is our contemporary, and I'm going to end on this note, because he wouldn't have dismissed ISIS as President Obama does, and other political leaders do in Europe, as retro or neo-medieval, words which we reach for whenever we wish to suggest that our enemies are at odds with history, because they're not. ISIS is a thoroughly 21st century organization. And Thucydides would have told us this if he were alive today. Thucydides is therefore on our side historically, which is why his work is what he wanted it to be, a possession for all times. And on that note, I will conclude my talk. Thank you very much.